Buonasera, benvenuti, good evening, and welcome to the Italian Academy. I am Barbara Faedda, the Academy's Executive Director, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all. Today we are glad to have here two very distinguished scholars who generously accepted our invitation to celebrate a complicated period for Italy and to critically investigate it as well. I am emphasizing their generosity because their task is not easy at all. They undertook to address historical facts and social and political issues of great complexity, and we are very grateful to them. This event is part of the Academy's Rule of Law initiative, which includes symposia and publications. In 2021, we released the interdisciplinary volume Rule of Law, Cases, Strategies and Interpretations, featuring essays that examine critical issues including racism, misinformation, human rights, women's status in society, the treatment of indigenous peoples, environmental justice, and related challenges. Building on that, in 2023, we convened a high-profile roundtable titled People, Rule of Law, and Supreme Courts Now, where 4 constitutional court judges from Europe and the US reflected on the present and future of the relationship between people and the rule of law. In 2024, we organized a thought-provoking dialogue between renowned legal scholars Philippe Sands and Monica Hakimi, exploring the intersection of decolonization, self-determination, and crimes against humanity. Our Rule of Law initiative aims to explore both historical and contemporary contexts in which the law no longer serves as a protection against the abuse of power and instead becomes a tool of unchecked authority. We are interested in examining situations where legal protections are eroded and fundamental rights are dismantled, particularly for marginalized and minority communities. Our work also investigates how legal institutions are sometimes manipulated to bypass constitutional limits and undermine democratic safeguards. So let's look at Italy. At the end of World War II, Italy faced numerous and profound challenges in rebuilding a functional rule of law while dealing with economic devastation and political instability. After 2 decades under Mussolini's authoritarian regime, after military defeat, and after the monarchy began to wane, the country had to transform dramatically, rebuilding its legal framework from a fascist apparatus into a democratic constitutional republic. Today we are honored to reflect on these complex chapters of Italian history with 2 distinguished scholars whose expertise brings exceptional depth and clarity to the subject. You will find their complete bios in the program, but let me briefly introduce them. David Forgacs teaches at New York University, where he holds the endowed Guido and Mariuccia Zerilli Marimo Chair of Contemporary Italian Studies. He taught previously at the universities of Sussex, Cambridge, where he was Fellow of Gonville and Caius College, Royal Holloway, London, and University College London, where he held the Panizzi Chair of Italian from 1999 to 2011. Books include Messaggi di sangue e la violenza nella storia d'Italia, la terza 2021, and Italy's Margins, Social Exclusion and Nation Formation since 1861, Cambridge University Press 2014. He is currently working on a film about the problematic history of security in Italy. Nadia Urbinati is Kyriakos Tsakopoulos Professor of Political Theory in the Department of Political Science at Columbia University. She is a member of the Accademia dei Lincei and was a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. She is a visiting professor at the Scuola Superiore di Studi Universitari e Perfezionamento Sant'Anna in Pisa and has taught at Bocconi University and Sciences Po. Together with Andrew Arato, she edited the academic journal Constellations. She works on modern and contemporary political thought, democratic and liberal theory, political representation, sovereignty, and transformations of democracy, such as populism, technocracy, and sortition. Publications include Mill and Democracy, 2004, Meet the People, How Populism Transforms Democracy, 2019, Democracy Disfigured, Opinion, Truth, and the People, 2014, Virtuous Hypocrisy, 2025, and with Christina Lafont, Defending Democracy Against Plutocracy, 2024. The program will be a two-way conversation with a brief final Q&A. I wish you a pleasant evening, and I now leave the stage to Professors Forgacs and Urbinati. Thank you.
I've got this microphone in front of my face, but just do that. Okay, so my bit, I'm going to talk about liberation and try and unpack this complicated term. And I want to ask a number of questions about it. Liberation from what? Liberation into what? And liberation for whom? And I also want to consider what kind of liberty or what kind of freedom was involved in this process. Now, it seems to me, I don't really know who everybody is here, but I suspect that quite a few of you know quite a lot of the history around this period. But for those who don't, I think I'll just give a little bit of background to what happened before April 25th, 1945. You need to remember that Italy had joined World War II in June 1940 on the side of Germany. Mussolini was an ally of Hitler. And they fought that war until July 1943, when there was a revolt of Mussolini's own cabinet, essentially under pressure from the military, from the generals, to get out of the war. He was then arrested under the orders of the king, Victor Emmanuel, and there was an interim period, the so-called 45 days, when there was a caretaker leader, Marshal Badoglio, an army marshal, field marshal, and during that period, Italy negotiated a secret armistice with the Allies, essentially with the British and the Americans. That armistice was made public on 8th of September 1943. The king and Badoglio had meanwhile fled down to the south to be safe. They gave no instructions to the army. The army was disbanded. It was a terrible, chaotic situation. The Germans had suspected what was going on, and they'd already invaded Italy, so they were ready to take over. So you then get the period between 8th of September 43 and 25th of April 1945, when there's a complex situation. The south has already been liberated by the Allies. Most of Italy from Naples upwards is still under now German control, and the Allies have to push northwards to liberate Italy. So Italy becomes a theatre of World War II. Alongside the Allied armies, you get volunteers, Italian partisans. Some of them are disbanded soldiers with military experience. Many of them are civilians, people who've refused to be conscripted into the army that's formed by what's continued of the fascists. I haven't mentioned that, but in October 43, the fascists reconstitute themselves. Mussolini is rescued. He's sent to Munich. He then becomes the head of a new fascist government based in the north. So this complex situation is happening in this period. The resistance is being fought alongside, as I say, the Allies' armies, and you push from south to north. So liberation is a process. It's not one thing. April 25th, 1945 is the end of a process which has a different geography, because Naples is liberated already at the end of September 43. Rome is liberated in June 44, Florence is liberated in August 44, and then the very long period until the liberation of the northern cities, including Bologna and Milan in April 45. So liberation is a process with a different geography. And of course, southern Italy has been liberated before liberation for a long time. It's living a different situation. I hope that helps a little bit, but let me go on to the questions here. What was Italy liberated from in 1945? One answer, it was liberated from military occupation by the Germans, and this meant three forces, essentially: the German army, the Wehrmacht, the SS, which was a kind of parallel army. It had its own military division called the Waffen-SS, very ruthless, strongly Nazified ideologically driven soldiers, combat units, who were responsible for most of the massacres of civilians that took place in Italy, as they had taken place in other parts of occupied Europe, and the Gestapo, the police. You could say that the occupation ended in 45, and clearly Italy was liberated from the foreigner, if you like, from the invasore, as you hear. And this is what is essentially commemorated. If you know the song Bella Ciao, that is the invasor that we're talking about. And that's the voice of the wonderful Giovanna Marini, who was then 82 years old, so she had a great voice. It sounds a bit cracked there. She sings that at home during the lockdown of the pandemic, and she makes a video to say, I want to communicate this song of resistance to a new generation. And then she died a few years after that. She died just last year. So that liberation, that bit of liberation happens, and it's clear that the Germans aren't going to come back. And in fact, as you probably know the history, suicide of Hitler is on the April 29th, is that right? Or April 30th, I'm not quite sure. I think perhaps the 20th, anyway, end of April. And then you have the Germany surrenders on May the 7th. So the end of the war in Europe. Okay, you have VE Day, May the 8th, and that's it. The war, of course, continues in the Pacific. It doesn't end until September 1945, after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Japanese surrender as well. And it's also liberation from the rule of the Repubblica Sociale Italiana, which is this kind of fascism phase 2 or Mark II, the reconstituted fascist leadership, which is now running a government from the north of Italy. And this is sometimes called by the resistance people Nazi fascismo. It's the collaboration between the Nazis and the hardline fascists who remained loyal to Mussolini right to the end. And that, I think it's important to understand, was an extremely violent period. It was a period in which there was a lot of fighting going on, but there were also a lot of summary killings. There were arrests of partisans who were often hanged in public squares. Some of them were arrested and hanged by the Italians, by the RSI, the Repubblica Sociale, some were by the Germans. The bodies were displayed, often with placards saying they have dared to attack the German occupation. So they were hung up like human scarecrows as a warning to people not to copy what they were doing. And there were also massacres of civilians, large number of massacres, as there were all over parts of German-occupied Europe between 43 and 45, or in fact 41 and 45. If you go on the web and you look up this wonderful Atlante delle stragi naziste e fasciste in Italia, it's got a map and you can zone into all these places. I don't want to say much about this. My book, Messaggi di Sangue, which Barbara mentions, has got a whole chapter on this, which is called Migliaia di Morti, thousands of dead people. And it has some gruesome images, which I don't want to show, but of these kind of images of executions. But these are some of the places you can look up. You look up the map, it gives you details of the numbers of victims, the numbers of adults, old people, children, women. These are some of the worst ones, very famous ones. Yeah, there's Spike Lee, yeah. Okay, this one, for instance, Montesolo, the Barzabotta massacre near Bologna, 770 victims, of which 115 were children.
Were you in a church?
Yeah, there was one of them was done in a church, yeah, that's right. Okay, so this very brutal period of the occupation, it ends definitively in 25th of April 1945, but it doesn't mean an end of violence. And I think one thing to understand is that after the liberation, after 25th of April, there is a lot of violence carried out by former partisans against fascists. There are reprisal killings, as often happens at the end of a civil war. The war has ended, but we're now going to finish you off. Fascism is still around. As long as the fascists are still alive, we're going to kill them. So there is a lot of this executions taking place particularly in end of April, May, into June 1945. Now, one of the motifs of this liberation is that we have liberated the patria, we liberated Italy, the fatherland. It's interesting because patria means fatherland, but it's a feminine noun in Italian, so it's a kind of father-mother. But you die, a lot of the partisans who were arrested and were sentenced to death, often, usually by firing squad, sometimes by hanging, many of them, they write letters to their loved ones, to their parents or to their children or to their partners, and they often say in these letters, I'm dying for freedom, I'm dying for a free Italy, muoio per un'Italia libera. I've got a couple here which I just thought I'd read one or two. They're very moving. This is a book that was published originally in 1955, edited by Giovanni Pirelli, who was the son of the Pirelli, the putative heir of the Pirelli tire company, who became a partisan and rejected his capitalist origins and became a socialist. And he edited this collection of letters, of hundreds of letters of people who were condemned to die. And this edition is actually very interesting. It came out in 1965, and it was published in omaggio. It was given free to students of the Scuola Media Superiore, Scuola Media Inferiore. It was given them as a kind of thing to teach them about the resistance, these letters of the condannati a morte. And I just thought I'd read one or two. This one, for instance, by, I can't read it very well, put my glasses on, I think. Riccardo Balmas, who was a former soldier, who writes to his mother, cara mamma e tutti, and he says at the end, I go to die gladly. I fought for my country. Another one from Arturo Capettini, who says he was 43 years old, a former soldier, a former commerciante, and he says, Caramanta bacio tutti per l'ultima volta, addio e viva l'Italia, e viva l'idea comune. One written by a very young man. Last one I'm going to read. No, I don't find it here. Okay. But he says he's an 18-year-old condemned to die, and he says, again, viva l'Italia libera, muoio per la patria. And I think what's interesting is this idea of the patria, which of course for years had been a fascist patria. It's the fascists who'd said, we have the patria, gets flipped over and it becomes something that you die for, the real Italy. We're now going to reclaim the patria, the real Italy, from the fascists. So it's the kind of currency that switches over and becomes something that the partisans are going to die for. So dying for Italy and dying for liberty. So I'm going the wrong way here. The last bit of the song goes like this. So the question is, you were liberated from the Germans, were you also liberated from fascism? And I think the answer is no. Fascism didn't die in April 25th, 1945. It lived on in complex ways. Mussolini died. He was shot by communist partisans on April 28th. He was discovered probably trying to get into Switzerland, near Dongo in the north, near the Lake of Como, and the bodies were brought back to Milan and put on display in Piazzale Loreto on April 29th, 1945. He was caught with his partner, his lover, Clara Petacci, and they were both hanged upside down. This is actually a very famous picture. They were not hanged up there. That wasn't the original idea. They were left on the ground, but the bodies were so damaged, people stamped on them, spat on them, urinated on them, that the partisans there, the CLN, said, we've got to get the bodies out of the way, and they hung them up on this gas station belonging to Standard Oil in Piazzale Loreto. Now, this was a deliberately chosen site because it was the same place when on August 10th, 1944, so less than a year earlier, 15 partisans had been shot in the square and their bodies had been left there. So it became a a recurrent motif in these reprisal killings to hang people or to kill people, former fascists, on the same place where a partisan had been hanged. And this happened all over liberated Italy. So there was a lot of violence after April 25th, as I said. There were these summary executions of fascists and collaborators. Several thousand were killed, particularly in what came to be called the Triangolo della Morte, around in Emilia-Romagna, around Bologna. There's a lot of killings of former fascists. And there were these head shavings of women collaborators. Again, a disturbing feature of this that happened also widely in France, where they were called les tendues, these women. These were women who had had relations with German soldiers or with SS, sometimes had given birth to children, and they were punished in this way. And it's a very interestingly kind of disturbing case because there's a lot of kind of collective misogyny here. I mean, the woman was punished in a way more than the men. She was symbolically defeminized by having her hair cut off, and then they were often paraded through the streets in these wagons when people could shout at them and spit at them, and a lot of the kind of anger against fascism was vented on these Italian women collaborators. Now, again, to understand the complexity of liberation, I think it's useful to remember that several wars were taking place between September 1943 and April 1945, this period that's sometimes just called the resistance. And we owe this way of thinking about it to the historian Claudio Pavone. And he talks about there being a patriotic war, the one I've described, which is the war against the Germans, to get the Germans out of Italy, to get out the invader. There was a civil war taking place, and there was a class war taking place. And just to go into the details there, the political war was... Sorry, I should put his name back again. Yeah, it comes from his book published in... There's an English translation, yeah, which came out in 2013 or something. Yeah, that's right, cool. I think it's just called A Civil War. Sorry, going the wrong way. So the patriotic war of the Italians fighting the Germans, the Civil War, Italians fighting Italians, which means, of course, Italian anti-fascists fighting Italian fascists, and a class war, the Italian working classes against the Italian property classes. The first two, I think, relatively easy to understand. The third is explained by the fact that a lot of the people in the resistance had origins in the socialist or communist movements. They'd been made illegal, of course, under Mussolini in 1926. These parties then came back in the resistance. Communist Party became a very large party already in 1946. And a lot of these people wanted there not to be a return to the kind of liberal order that there'd been before 1922, before the fascists came to power. They wanted to move on to a socialist or a more progressive collectivist future. So there was a strong movement by many of the people who'd been active partisans to have a socialist or a communist Italy at the end of the war. And you see this in quite a lot of the things they published in this period. This is from Torino in 25th of April. They publish the communists and socialists together, the Giunta Intesa Piemontese, in Piedmont, the coalition of the socialists and communists say that there will be a people's liberation, a riscatto nazionale, a national redemption for our freedom and independence of the people. So this is the class interpretation. There will be a kind of class revolution taking place after 1945. And of course, this didn't happen. It didn't happen for a number of reasons, but one of the main reasons it didn't happen is the leader of the Communist Party, or the General Secretary, as he was called, Palmiro Togliatti, said, we don't want to have a revolution. He told his own party membership to respect the orders to work with the Badoglio government and then to work with the other parties in a coalition. And this was part of the Communist Party's strategy of working through Parliament and not having a kind of seizure of the storming of the Winter Palace like in 1917. They wanted to use parliamentary means and grassroots membership to move towards socialism rather than having one act of a revolution. So I've said that the liberation didn't necessarily mean the end of fascism. And it didn't mean it for a number of reasons, which I think we might go into a bit more, but it also didn't mean liberation from rule by the propertied classes, as the socialists and communists or many of the rank and file expected that to happen or wanted that to happen. And this word liberation or freedom comes in many publications. L'Italia Libera was the newspaper of the Partito d'Azione, this party that was formed in 1942 and dissolved already in 1947, which included many important intellectuals and leaders. Ferruccio Parri, the first post-war prime minister, was from that party. But they wanted not a communist or a socialist model, but something in between, a kind of liberal socialist setup. But they clearly didn't want to return to what had happened before. They talk about, this is already in 1943 when this paper is set up, they want to have a regime founded on civil liberties, civil and political liberties. So they were looking to something that would radically change the setup and not something that would go back to what had existed before fascism. And I just wanted to say, obviously, liberation isn't just an Italian notion, it's all over the resistance movements all over Europe, Greece and so on, the French resistance. This is the newspaper of the Libération Nord, which is the northern branch of the French resistance. It's called Libération. And this is published just after the D-Day landings, showing how we're going to collaborate with the Allies to liberate France. Libération in the 70s is a radical left-wing newspaper. It's not anymore. It's become extremely moderate, sort of liberal, slightly left paper. But it was a radical paper under Jean-Paul Sartre. He was one of the first editors of the paper in the 1970s. So this term liberation doesn't just belong to Italy. It doesn't just belong to Europe. It's also in African liberation, particularly the socialist movements for a free Africa using this term. This is for something that's going to happen in 1 month from now. African Liberation Day. And just again to say that the importance of this idea that we're not going to go back, we're going to go forward, is here in this clip from this little piece of the Italia Libera, again the Partito d'Azione. Okay, and I'm going to end this bit here, I think, and let Nadia take over, but I just wanted to give that kind of quick picture of the different meanings of liberation. And we're going to pass over to talking about this now, the liberation into what? Well, one of the things you're liberating Italy into is a new democratic framework. I think the one bit of this that all the parties could agree on, including the Communist Party, the Socialists and the Partito d'Azione, is that you're going to move away from what fascism had, which is a one-party state, no free elections, only plebiscites, no freedom of thought, complete control of the media, no votes for women. You're going to move into a different order in which all these things are going to be guaranteed for the first time. Yep.
It's okay? Yeah, okay. So thank you, David. These are great introductions that makes my life easier in some sense. These years have been they were very complex because it's not simply north and south, the center of Italy, but also in the north we have different situations. And I would like to give you an example of that to understand in what sense the resistance was, along with the liberation, which is the final, the permanent process toward the liberation is made also through resistance and military actions by free people organizing themselves, not always within parties or under parties, mostly also without any parties or in autonomous bands of partisans. What it is very interesting of the resistance, it is this example that I would like to give you to understand how resistance is the origin, the cradle of democracy. This is the idea of Bobbio, Norberto Bobbio, but it's not only his idea. There was the common understanding of the resistance as a democratic phenomenon itself, not simply after the resistance, but during the resistance. And I'd like to give you thus this example. In Piedmont, there were some small towns in the countryside which were liberated by partisans, liberated against Nazi fascists. And the question that is interesting to see, it is that in every village that was liberated, what the people did, there was no state in Italy at that point. The state, it was like a state of nature a la Thomas Hobbes, right? No state. The village, the people living in the village, they immediately wrote down their rules. They wrote down like small constitutions. As soon as they liberate themselves from fascism, and they didn't have a state, reference state in Rome, because there was no longer states at that point, waiting for a state to start again and to reorganize itself, what they did was to give civil life to them. Civil life in this case means civilized. It means based on norms or laws or rules shared by everybody. And each village had its own organization. It was like a constituent power from the bottom up. This was very unique. So we can see, and there are some books very interesting, collecting all the documents of these small towns becoming autonomous republics. They declared themselves to be autonomous republics, and they organized their life in different ways. One of them would include women in the demos, giving women universal suffrage. Others, they wouldn't. Some would share and divide the land proportionally to the needs. Others wouldn't. Some would have a kind of direct elections, electing immediately the members of the municipal council. Others wouldn't do that. So it was a kind of pluralism, even in the attempt to give themselves rules. There was no a playbook where to look at or a matrix where to refer to. They created their own laws in relation to the tradition they had, probably, in relation also to that was before the fascism itself. But what I wanted to stress very much, that was a moment of resistance. It was not after that, because the war was still going on. So it means that the resistance was, Bob is very good in this book to analyzing that, it was a truly claim of democracy. So if we ask them what is resistance, we can say, yes, it is of course the anti-fascist, the highest anti-fascist expression of rebellion, but in that anti-fascism there is something positive. It's not the anti simply, it is the positive or for something. And that for something is expressed by the way in which people organize themselves in brigades, fought themselves this war. They gave themselves rules, because each brigade gave themselves rules according to which how to obey, who should organize the plan for actions, the strategy, what to do with the prisoner, because there are no prisoners. This is a civil war. In the civil wars, there are no prisoners to begin with. It's very complicated to give themselves laws. So they try to do that. And this is admirable, because it was not a moment of anarchy. It was a moment of political constructions of self-government in some sense. And for this reason, we can start talking about democracy there, from that moment. Another element that it's very interesting to analyze in relation to resistance is the following. The resistance was not manipulated by parties. Parties tried to manipulate it. Some of them, they tried to have the rulership of the brigade. Some of them, they didn't succeed in doing so. So it was very self-organized kind of struggle, the one that we are talking about. And this allows also to understand the role of women. I would like to to open a parenthesis here, because it's very important. Can I have some more?
Yeah, sure. This is my
Now, women and resistance is an important connection to understand what I think it is a very important contribution of Italy to democracy. Italy was born democratic in the moment in which it became democratic, because women were inside. They were not given after. They were not given after the right to vote. They were part of the making of the democratic Italy, and they achieved immediately the right to vote. Look, this seems to be a banality, but is not. Why? Now, think about that. Italy was the last one, along with France, to give the right to vote to women in the suffrage in Europe. And it was a long process to convince people in Italy before fascism, during fascism. No, well, during fascism there was no sense because they abolished the elections. But at the beginning, before fascism became a regime, even fascism was ready to recognize some municipal right to vote. Now, it was difficult for women to demonstrate that they deserved to become citizens. They were able to serve in the war of 1911 in Libya, of course, a colonization war, by working or serving in the Red Cross. They helped. Or at home, they worked in the place of men in the countryside or in the factory. So they served the nations when the nation was fighting. Yet it was not enough. It was never enough. They never deserved to be citizens. What's happened that? I was shocked when I read it. Okay. One day, meaning February the 1st, 1945, the meeting of the government was not a stable government, but a transition government, an interim government by Bonomi, had the last meeting of the day with the 6 items to discuss. The item concerning the giving rights to women, the right to vote to women, was the last one. They didn't even discuss about it. They say immediately yes. So after decades, I would say a century of fight for the right, that right didn't even was conquered out of a long discussion, different opinions, a voting. It was a yes. Fantastic, right? Immediately, like that. How it was possible? Now, this is the moment of resistance. I found in very interesting recollections of women fighting for resistance, and they are very conscious of that. So in the very moment, there was no longer a state with an army in which, of course, women could never be part of the army, but in that moment in which the state was dismembered, was no longer in action, particularly the South, and they had to construct partisan armies. Partisan armies are voluntary armies. So they volunteer, they create themselves like partisan movements and brigades. At that point, voluntary decision, freedom of choice, gave women the possibility of deciding to fight. And this basic decision, which is the most democratic moment, the decision of making ourselves in the service of, it became free and possible. So that was very important. So they deserved truly, but because there was no longer a state, but because it was a voluntary decision, the decision to fight. So that was an important moment. And it was also an important moment. Why? Of course, the mentality didn't change. The mentality didn't change. Even in the brigade of the partisan, there was the same, patriarchal mentality that women had at home. Remember that many of them were very young, 15, 16, 17, 18. Why they left home? They escaped home, some of them. They escaped home, some of them, in order to be free to fight, to be free to be like men, as they used to say in a beautiful book of collections of memories by Miriam Afai. We wanted to be like them, like men, fighting with a rifle and be able to say yes and no to a captain, not to a father or a husband. So this kind of emancipation through the fight, it was an important driving moment. Of course, when they were in the brigade, they were not free at all because they had to do exactly what they used to do at home. They have to cook. They have to prepare for everyday life of the man. So they realized that it was never enough. It was not them. Not in that moment was enough. And yet, they were capable of saying no if they wanted. Say no if they wanted. And that was the discovery of democracy. So that is a very important example for me because it implies two things. First, the resistance was a moment of emancipation made by very people who decide to emancipate themselves. Nobody imposed on them to do it. Nobody liberated them. They liberated themselves, by themselves. Second, they did so by knowing that they were risking, of course, because weapons also imply risks, and they can. But this was not enough reason for them to make a calculations of not to go. So there was really a spirit of freedom in that partisan decisions. And finally, as I said before, the partisan moment was a moment of claim for a different organization of power. Because when women criticize men in their brigades not to recognize them as equal soldiers, they were making a right claim in that moment because they were identical in front of a state that did not exist. They were identical to men at that point because they decided to fight. So in the name of equality in decision of becoming free citizens, they made themselves, all of them, men and women at this point, they made themselves the very protagonists of democracy. So for this reason, there is in the resistance phenomenon an element of self-government. It is a kind of preparation for a civil government, how it could be. So it is a kind of preparation of what Italy would have been after, right? And so both the republics that I mentioned before and the case of women, they testify of this important foundational moment of democracy, which technically my colleagues, theorists, they call it constituent power. It's the moment in which the power constitutes itself through the decisions of the people to have the express presence in power, not simply indirect by somebody else, but directly. So I think that this needs to be characterized, because generally we talk about resistance as violent. Of course it was violent, as a form of war. Of course it was a form of war. It was a terrible form of war because it was outside of state organizations, and for this reason, no prisoner. It was a civil war even if when it was not a civil war that is against the Germans, it was in any case a radical expression of violence. So, but it was not only that. I insist on that because it was a moment of self-constructions of a democratic society, and people did not even know what democracy was. So there is something to say about that. They didn't know, they never read books about democracy. Italy never read books about democracy. The only book we had on democracy was a translation, only in the 50s, those, by Hans Kelsen on democracy. He published the book in 1929, but of course it was not translated into Italian until the 50s. So they didn't have books or sources for understanding what democracy, and yet they were able to to act as Democrats. And this was admirable, not because they were Italian, but it was admirable because this is what the self-governing moment of foundation means, and that is an explication, an exemplification.
Thank you, Nadia. Great. I'm going to pick up the thing about women in a minute. I just wanted to come back to this question about what Italy was liberated from or what it wasn't liberated from. So it was clearly liberating to this new democratic framework, and we're going to say something about the Constitution, which is a process of framing this very radical constitution, probably one of the most advanced in the world, produced between 1945 and the end of 1947, and it's introduced at the beginning of, 46, and it's introduced in 1948. That's right. So from June, the elections to the Constituent Assembly in 46 to the end of 47, they're framing this new document that's going to be the basic law of the state. So it's liberation from those things, but it's not emancipation from capitalism. It's not an emancipation from liberal democracy via social revolution, as many of the rank and file members of the Communist Party wanted, against their own leadership. And of course, it's not emancipation of women from patriarchy. It's still not going to be happened. There's also what Claudio Pavone, again, a phrase that he coined, I think, in an important paper of the 1980s, called continuity of the state. One of the ways in which the fascist regime didn't die on April 25th, 1945, is there was continuity of personnel, senior personnel in the magistrature. These are judges who've been fascist judges who become Republican judges, the armed forces, a lot of continuity, and the police. And this is notorious continuity, so that under Schelber, who's the Christian Democrat Minister of the Interior in the 1940s, he represses social protest in the same way that the fascists would have done, and he's considered to be a sort of continuation of fascism in the police. So there's a lot of hostility and opposition by members of particularly the left-wing parties, to the new state that forms after 1945, after 46. That there's quite a lot of continuity there. There had been attempts to break that. You talk about the radical moment of the resistance. One of the things that happens in the resistance is the CLN, the Comitati di Liberazione Nazionale, have in individual workplaces, they form their own committees, which are these workplace committees. For instance, Mondadori, the publisher in Milan, Arnoldo Mondadori, the boss, goes off to flees to Switzerland, and the workers take over his press and his printing press, and they want to have a kind of socialist Mondadori, and they're not going to let the boss come back in, and they want to have a trial and purge him. Fiat has a CLN Aziendale. Pirelli has one. The newspaper Corriere della Sera has its own journalists taking over the newspaper. So there's a hope that somehow the old order is not going to come back in, and there's going to be some continuity of this radical process, but it doesn't happen. There's a very quick restoration, which of course the Allies, who are there occupying Italy after the liberation, the British and the Americans are making sure that this doesn't happen, that there's not going to be this radical transformation. So you get the beginnings of the Cold War. And this is fundamental, I think, for understanding the way that the resistance comes to be commemorated. The two main parties, really the two largest parties after 1945 in Italy, are on the one hand the Christian Democrats, who pretty much run, either in coalition with left or right parties, they run Italy from 1945 to 1994. And the communists are always, the second largest party, are always excluded from government. They're a permanent opposition. And this, of course, is all managed or overseen by the United States, who wants to make sure that communists don't come into power, because that's letting in Russian influence, Soviet influence. So a lot of this is controlled by international forces. But what this means is that the resistance, which had been seen by its participants as an alliance of these different parties, Christian Democrats, Communists, Socialists, Action Party, Liberals, Republicans, breaks apart in 1946 as the Cold War starts. And you have this then permanent conflict between the two sides. And what that means is that two of these main groups that have participated in the resistance want to commemorate it in different ways. And I'll give you one example of this. In 1948, the Christian Democrats win by a landslide the first election under the new constitution, 18th of April 1948. Just a few days later is going to be the 25th of April, the commemoration of the resistance. And the leader of the Christian Democrats, the Prime Minister, Alcide De Gasperi, says, we want to avoid having a big commemoration. We want to have a kind of quiet event. And you may notice that Giorgia Meloni has said something very similar. She was about to go off to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Unfortunately, she had to stay in Italy because of the Pope's funeral on Saturday. She would have liked to be out of Italy for the 25th of April, but she did make sure that there's going to be 5 days of national mourning now, including the 25th of April, and she's said also directly, but also through the Minister of, what's he called, the Nello Musumeci, has said there must be commemorazione sobria. There must be a sober commemoration. We don't want big, politicized commemoration. Now, it's quite interesting that De Gasperi in 1948 and Meloni in 2025 are saying the same thing. Let's make sure that the left doesn't dominate commemoration, because we'd like not to talk about the resistance, we'd like not to talk about the liberation, because we're in a new kind of Italy that is not based on the values of the resistance. So this has become a kind of political football, and it has been since 1994, since the right really came into power, back into power in Italy after a long period when they'd been out and these new parties formed and so on. So if you look at the history of the commemoration of the 25th of April, from 1948, 46 through the Cold War, which kind of ends, I suppose, in 1991, more or less, when the Communist Party dissolves, there's been this conflict over how to commemorate the resistance. Pretty much for the whole period from, let's say, the early 50s through till the, let's say, the mid-80s, when Craxi was prime minister, there was a kind of consensus that the resistance was a good thing to remember. Most parties could agree, including the Christian Democrats, that we were in an Italy that was founded by the resistance. They played a part in that. But really, once you get into 94 and you get the Alleanza Nazionale, the fascists coming back into government, remember, they've been around, you know, for 30 years now. They didn't just come in 2022. There's been a lot of tension over how to remember this. The right really doesn't want to talk too much about the resistance. The left would like to push it and say that that's the foundation of contemporary Italy. And so it's become a battleground. And this is one example of this CLN Aziendale you can see there. I just want to show you that when the Corriere della Sera was briefly taken over by its own typographers and journalists. But of course, then they made sure that the owning family came back in under control. And this is the thing I was talking about. So these commemorations of April 25th have been marked by tension between what I call celebration of a successful liberation and reflection on a failed or incomplete liberation. The liberation that the more radical wing of the resistance wanted to happen clearly did not happen. And it didn't happen because the Allies made sure the Christian Democrats were in power, communists were excluded from power, Italy was split into two. Liberation for whom? Well, this is where we come back to looking at the question of women. If I can get onto this. Should I go on to my next slide? Yeah. So liberty, this is Delacroix's famous painting of liberty leading the people, sometimes known in France as Marianne. She has this name, but she is, of course, the Roman goddess of libertas, who is always represented in old coins as holding this Phrygian cap. She's actually got it on her head, and she's holding the tricolor flag, and she's flanked by a whole lot of men. So liberty has always been personified as a woman. And the irony, of course, here is that women were not liberated, but the liberator is always this female figure. That's from 1848. This is the coin of Libertas holding the fasces, so long before the fascists picked it up, this was used because it's a Roman Republican symbol. She's got the 7 stars. So this is essentially the image of the Statue of Liberty that France donated to the United States in the 1860s. There she's standing up with a hand raised like Marianne. Here she's holding the fasces. And of course, in a way, in popular memory, and popular culture, women did represent the resistance. Anna Magnani, I suppose, as Pina in Rome Open City, another film which is absolutely of its time, because you couldn't make a film with a Catholic priest and a communist working together in 1946, because the Cold War had come in. The communists were the enemy. But this little jewel of 1945 has a woman as a protagonist. There she's being harassed by an SS soldier. She slaps his wrist and goes off to run after Francesco, her husband-to-be, who's just been taken away. She's holding up her arm, a little bit like Liberty. I'm not sure if that's deliberate. She's shot by an unseen SS soldier, and she's cradled there in this kind of reverse pietà by Aldo Fabrizi, Don Pietro. And her little son, Marcello, goes up and, she finds his mother dead. It's a very, very moving scene. But again, this idea that somehow Anna Magnani was the sort of libertas figure in post-war popular culture. She comes out again as L'Onorevole Angelina, a woman in a poor working-class neighborhood in Rome who leads a women's protest over housing rights. And I wanted to show a couple of clips here. One is this testimony of a former partisan. This is, as Nadia was saying, women were actively involved in the resistance. She's pictured here with her husband, who was, I don't remember his first name, but anyway, Beltrami. He'd been a former soldier. He was killed by the Germans. He was in a raid. He was another partisan. She was herself a partisan. And in this testimony, she talks about the disappointment that many women felt who'd been partisans, that they were given the vote in 1946, but the representation in Parliament was very small. I think was it 11 or so women in the Constituent Assembly and about 40 in 40-something, 48 in 1948 election. So a very, very small number of women, despite the fact they were half the voting population. And another testimony, another film clip from a film made in the Netherlands in 1980, very interesting one, because there's an interview with Isotta Gaeta, who was done, I think, in 1979. She was 6 years there. That's her on the right there. Her mother, who was called Anti-Zarina Cavallo, was another partisan. And as I say, she was 16 when she joined the partisan brigades, and she's talking about her memory. And this is an interesting one because she is doing this interview in 78. So she's was a young woman in 1944-45, took part in the resistance then. As a mother and as a woman, she lives through the feminist movement of the 1970s. So her reflection on the 1940s is somehow marked by the experience of having lived through feminism, and it makes her very critical of what she went through. So I'm going to end my bit here. The question is, what kind of freedom? So freedom from what, I think, and into what, and for whom we looked at. But the question is, what kind of liberty was achieved in 1945? And I think that pass back to Nadia for that one.
This is very interesting. Also, these clips are very telling somehow. Now, so as soon as peace came after April the 25th, 45, immediately all the political parties, left, center, right, democratic, Christian, liberal, republics, they were part of some of them, not all of them, the socialists and the communists, they told women inside of the brigades, go home, life goes back as it was before, everything is going to be safe and clear now, we are free, there is nothing more for you to do, go back. And that was, Miriam Afai has fantastic comments on that, because she was, of course, young enough to understand what does it mean to go back. There is no back. You tell us that there is no back for politics because we don't want to go back to the liberalism before fascism, and now you tell us that we have to go back. There is no back. Which back? So when you define the back, you have to define the relations of power within family, and that is, they started thinking in this way, women. There were not very many, the women who participated in the Constitutional Assembly, but very important. There were 21 women, 9 communists, 9 democratic Christians, 4 socialists, 1 uomo qualunque. So there were a mix of them, but they were united when they had to discuss about issues concerning family, jobs, healthcare, and all this stuff that then we have in the constitutions, okay? But it was complex, even among them, to make clear that they were not divided by ideologies when they have to talk about the topic. So it was extremely important what kind of freedom. I want now to go to the Constitution itself, because according to me, what kind of freedom is the best way we have in this Constitution. Now, historically, constitutions, modern constitution, that is for the 18th century on, have been written constitution, okay? Written constitutions. Before, it was very hard to write a constitution because the cities were very divided, and so they couldn't agree on almost nothing. But starting with the 18th century, constitutions started to be written by whom? In the States. The United States is the model for writing a constitution, as we know. To elect a convention. The convention has to write the constitutions, and so on and so forth. The convention of the United States had no parties. They were simply individual related to the states, but they didn't have parties inside of the Constitutional Assembly or the convention here in the States. In Italy, they did. So the Italian Constitution was a peculiar one because it was based on parties and not on simply elected representatives from the bottom up. And thus, the party has to find an agreement. So the Constitution was not unanimity. They didn't find 100%. There was a small minority, but there was a minority. Second, they had to find agreement among them. There are fabulous discussion in the Constitutional Assembly between Catholic and Communist, between Socialist and Liberal, concerning the meaning of private property, or whether the Constitution should have the right to resistance, to rebel, or whether it's possible to have private property confiscated, and when and how, or whether we should have a federation instead of a unity. There was a huge discussion about that. So that was a real kind of university of constitution. They learned how to write the constitutions. The Minister of the Constitutions, which the Governo Parri instituted, had the task of translating the most important constitutions. So they translated it into Italian, of course, the American Constitution, which was partly already translated, the French Constitution, the first one of 1789, but also the others, the Soviet Constitution of the 36, which was very important to them, and other constitutions, in order to understand how to frame the issues. They were totally incapable. They were simply ordinary citizens. They didn't know how to write a constitution. And they learned to do it together. And I would like to tell you also that it is a detail that tells us a lot about writing a constitution among people who don't know each other, sometimes don't trust each other, and yet they are capable of making an agreement, to reach an agreement. Now, that was a situation without the government. It was a provisional government. The collapse of, there was still, there was no longer the monarchy after 46, after June the 2nd, 46. So the Constitutional Assembly was the first democratically elected by men and women, as we said, assemblies. They had to decide whether this assembly had to also play the role of government or not, because there was not an elected government or an elected parliament. So they made this decision, very important, to divide their labor. They used to discuss in the kind of assembly, parliamentary kind of, it was not elected at this point. The first parliamentary elections were in 48. So in the morning, they govern. And they used to talk in the strong, direct way, to conflict, to disagree, and in the afternoon, they met as Constitutional Assembly members, founders, and they changed their way of behaving. They didn't use the you, il tu, they used the lei, the impersonal way, even if they were part of the same parties. And they divided the way in which they used to discuss according to topics they want to solve, according to the goal they had to reach, that is to have basic rights, to have the organization of the states. And they divided themselves into many subcommittees, each of them very importantly discussed. At the end, in March in 47, they had the plenary session of the assembly in which each article was discussed and then voted on. Now, I'd like to also to add, to understand that the creativity, this is new. They didn't learn primarily by themselves, and they made also mistakes. Now, since they were very picky with the Italian language, they were great students and scholars, some of them were important scholars, they were more important Latinists there. No? They gave this text, which was written in a good way, but not yet perfect, to one of the most important professor of Italian and, Latin Italian language, in order to put it in a good Italian, so that people could read, understand, and possibly memorize it. So the articles were very short, they were written beautifully, and that was a piece of art in some sense. So they were so proud of that they were able at the end of solving conflicts, coming to agreements, reaching a constitution that is an excellent one. And I would say that that constitution has something that all constitutions written directly by the people should have in order to last. So this, Zagabeschi says, they should be loved by the people. And I think in Italy there is this attraction, sentimental attraction to the constitution, even more than to parties or to the states, to the constitution. And this is a good way of translating, and a good way of saying that there was a patriotism, a constitutional patriotism. the patriotism of the Constitution. I find this always very attractive, because recently we started trashing down the constitutions and saying that, okay, I mean, the government operates in that way, the Constitution said opposite, but still now, the Constitution is not considered to be a piece of paper, even if governments have humiliated it and sometimes violated it. And yet they made the difference between a constitution and government is so clear, and it was achieved by, by learning by themselves without any schooling about constitutionalism. It's a very good example of how to write a constitution without being able to write a constitution. Right?
I think we can end there and maybe have a discussion. Just one thing I wanted to say, since I didn't get to add on this, is that one of the articles of the Constitution, it's Article 12 of the Disposizioni Transitorie e Finali, says, and I'll quote it, if I've got it written down here, yeah, è vietata la riorganizzazione sotto qualsiasi forma del disciolto partito fascista. So it is forbidden to reorganize the dissolved fascist party. What happens is the fascist party does exist in Italy.
But under a different name.
Under a different name, but it says sotto qualsiasi forma. And some of the leading fascists, including some of the hardliners of the Repubblica Sociale, including Giorgio Almirante, come in as the leaders of this party. This party is a minor party. It doesn't have a significant political presence until 1960, when the Tambroni government, DC government, tries to proposes to make a coalition with them. There's a huge protest, and it's very interesting that in 1960, which of course is just 15 years after the liberation, there's a massive popular protest in Genova, which of course has the Medaglia d'Oro. It's one of the great resistant cities. The only city that has this, where in fact Mattarella is going on Friday to speak, despite Meloni's attempt to quash this. He's going there. And there's a huge resistance. So in a way, the kind of collective sense of the resistance as opposing fascism continues. But then, of course, this trickle of fascism then becomes a flood, and the fascists come back, and again under a different name, Alleanza Nazionale in 1994, and then they turn into Fratelli d'Italia, which still uses the tricolour flame as its symbol. In other words, the very symbol of the MSI is now the symbol of the party of government in Italy. So fascism doesn't die, and it doesn't die also in the sense that there's a kind of grassroots radical fascist movement of these terrorists in the 1970s who are very, very important. They put bombs on trains, in banks, in railway stations, and kill many people as an attempt to kind of destabilize the system. So that kind of violent fascism is present in the DNA of the beginning of Italy, despite the constitution, and they continue throughout. I just wanted to say that because, unfortunately, what was supposed to have died on April 25th, 1945 did not die.
No, they don't die.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Larissa. I'll be a law student starting at Harvard Law this upcoming fall. And my question has to do with the concept. I really love that you guys described the concept of resistance as a democratic process. And I think that democracy is something that we have to constantly maintain, like was just talked about. There's the continual rise of fascism even today. And so my question is, if we are to learn from history and connect this historical moment to the modern day, what do you guys see as the biggest threat to liberation and freedom in today's society, in Italy, as well as in the global society?
Now, would you allow me to talk about the United States now? Okay, good. Now, I like to stress a paradox. I think that we live in a paradoxical time. Because, as David told us since the beginning, there was the Allies, they were the Allies. The Allies came to sacrifice themselves, from Normandy but also the other Allies, the Soviet Allies. They sacrificed a lot of lives for liberating themselves and Europe from the Nazi fascists. So there was a kind of general alliance that then break down with the Cold War, but still. Today, these two allies, the United States and Russia, they are both of them not very friendly to Europe and not very friendly to the kind of democracy that Europe was able to achieve. And this, for me, is very incredible. Because I never thought that, but it is as if Europe now has a kind of, I don't know whether they will do so, but that would be very interesting if they felt that they could challenge at least the US allies, leaving aside Russia because it's another story, but to challenge, to be consistent with the democratic foundation of Europe, which they contribute in making possible. So I think that the history of democracy starts all over again by challenging again those who were supposed to defend it. So yes, I think democracy is under threat today. It's clear that it's under threat. So this history that we celebrate in the 80 years of the end of World War II can be an important opportunity, not to celebrate in the, symbolic, which is good, all ritual way, but to celebrate by thinking and reflecting upon the value of democracy under threat today. In some sense, liberation is in the second stage now, perhaps.
Well, maybe we should make a distinction between domestic democracy and foreign democracy when it comes to the United States and Russia, in the sense that I'm not so sure that the liberation brought about by the American president, which was incredible, of course, had the same goals that they would have had if to protect democracy in the United States. If I'm not mistaken, the idea of the American army was to keep Mussolini alive rather than to dispose of him and possibly to reconstitute the fascist regime as an opposition to the communist threat. At least this is what I read in, and also sometimes in the movie, like Lizzani's Mussolini's Last Days. So that's my real question. I mean, do you think that is correct or not? The second thing is a rather trivial question about the fact that after the war, when finally the suffrage was granted to women, when women turned 21, they could vote for both the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies. But men had to wait until they were 25. And the assumption, oh yeah, that is the case. I lived through that myself. Because apparently women matured more quickly. And when I voted for the first time in Italy, my wife voted, who was slightly older than I, voted for both chamber, and I could only vote for the lower chamber.
Not for me, not in my case.
Okay, well, in any case, I was born before the war, so I don't know, that's what happened to it.
No idea. I know that women, first they received the right to vote in 45. In 46, they could have been elected, so the completion of the right to vote. Yet, a prostitute could not vote until 55, because in Italy there were still the brodel. What was the name, Ms. Dice? The brothels. And so they had to close them and to make women free from the subjection of these terrible job, and to make them free and free from, and then to give them the right to vote. So the completion of the right to vote came 1955, de facto. I didn't know that women could have voted. Good. This is something I voted. I voted for the first time. Okay, so I cannot say. As to the other question, I don't know, democracy domestic and democracy international. I don't see that democracy international. Democracy is a domestic fact. It's a form of government. Internationally, there can be relations of, among states that can be more or less civil and more or less based on rights or more or less violent instead, but democracy is more state-based or internally, domestically. Yes, you are right. They were, of course, very The 47 was an important, 45 Yalta, 47 the agreement of having, in the case of Italy, of having the end of the collaboration between leftist and center-right parties, and it was the beginning of the Cold War. And the Cold War was a really Manichaean phenomenon, that for sure. Yet there was a moment between the 43 and 45, before Yalta, in which the possibilities were all open. And it was not so predetermined how the situation could evolve. Thank you.
I'm Beatrice. Thank you so much for both speeches. I have a question on memory and the legacy of this day and what the resistance means and what Liberation Day is. And the reason why I'm saying this is because I'm worried for two main reasons. One is the political factor that you also mentioned, the fact that over the past years, I would say last years, there have been attempts on some side of the political spectrum to kind of make this day like marginal somehow. You mentioned what just happened a few days ago. And the second reason I would say it's a generational factor. I think I'm one of the last one as an Italian raised in Italy to have done homeworks when I was at elementary school, just having to interview grandparents and uncles talking about what their experience was with the resistance and stuff like that. And I think that was a huge part of the way I was able to learn about this, because as long as I work with data and numbers, I think narratives and stories are much more powerful. And what you showed before was super interesting and moving. So I wonder whether, first of all, you're worried about the legacy and the memory about this day, and what do you think we should do to make sure that this day keeps being such an important day that we all know about and we all care about? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's, of course, a very difficult one because, as you pointed out, the generation who fought in the resistance are now almost all dead. That young woman who was 16 when she fought died in 2004, I think you noticed. So it's the same story about, the kind of forgetting of the Holocaust. There are no living Holocaust survivors now, very, very few, I think. And in 10 years' time, there is certainly going to be none left. So how do you maintain the memory of a terrible event or an important historical event when the generations are no longer alive? One way you do it is through these rituals of commemoration, just as Holocaust Remembrance Day or the Giorno della Memoria was instituted in Italy and France and Germany, I think, in 2000. And it's commemorated annually on January 27th. So the 25th of April is one way you do that. The other thing is having rituals around monuments. I mean, Italy is full of plaques and cippi and targhe of partisans who were killed. Squares are named after them. So the naming of places and having rituals taking place there and bringing school kids there is one of the way you do it. You transmit it to younger generations. But there needs to be a state involvement in this. You have to have a state that wants to do this. And of course, one of the problems is the state or the present government is not committed to doing this. So, it's a very good question. I think...
They're committed to amnesty.
Yeah, to forgetting, to amnesia. That's right. Yeah, they are. So, I don't have a happy answer to that. But yeah, the answer is, in any kind of large historical event you want to transmit, you have to have active rituals of commemoration and processes of collective remembering.
I really love the way you describe the local communities creating their own documents. This is in Piedmont?
Piedmont. It's called
So-
the Repubblica di Val d'Ossola.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a
Val
valley
d'Ossola,
with
yeah.
several small cities, villages.
So I was just wondering, like, in terms of resistance now to the, political party in power, is there local, like, in America, we have, like, maybe New York or California somewhat resisting. Is it like that in Italy, where the local municipalities are resisting?
Resistance to
Meloni party?
demonstrations, you mean?
No,
on
no,
the
local
square?
communities, can they, I don't know, have local laws.
Yeah, we have, of course, municipal towns with the, mayor and the assembly, and yes, and also local inside of the municipal, we have neighborhood assemblies. They are no longer as strong as they were, because one issue was also that there was a kind of diminishing of the democratic institutions during the last 30 years. For instance, we used to vote also for the neighborhood assembly. Now we don't, because they are nominated by the mayor. So there was this kind of decreasing of democratic institutions. This is true. But still, there are, yes, we have a local, very strong, actually. Cities are more important than regions in Italy somehow.
Okay.
So I think that we all agree that this was a truly enlightening and stimulating conversation. First of all, I thank you all for being part of this important event tonight. Please join me in thanking our wonderful